Good morning, everyone. How we doing? So, real quick reminder, you can tell it's Thanksgiving for the adults too, right? Everybody's traveling, I suppose. Real quick reminder that we obviously do not meet next week, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and then we will resume the following Sunday, which is the first Sunday of Advent. So please take one of these books. Do you remember that that Father Rainey, when he did his talk on the Eucharist, he mentioned this particular book by Bishop Barron? So we ordered those for everyone. So please take one. And also I have a real quick housekeeping kind of note for you. We will be dismissing early this morning. I'll be probably dismissing about 5 minutes to 10. Okay, so don't be worried about me. But anyway, so today we're going to talk a little bit about kind of taking a segue from what Deacon John talked about saints and holiness. I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to go back and revisit the topic of the communion of saints. Our topic that is actually published in the resource guide, don't y'all love this? Don't y'all love this engraving? This is a colorized version. Anybody recognize the artist? Gustave Doré. He's the one who did all of the illustrations, late 19th century, did all the illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy. And this is a colorized version of one that depicts a paradise. Obviously, you can see them overlooking the heavenly Jerusalem. So this kind of ties in with our theme. But real quickly, to touch on what is in your resource guide, there's actually an excerpt from it's a sermon. He calls it a sermon. And it probably was. Homilies are related to the readings, remember, and sermons you can talk about anything you want to. So this is one of St. Augustine's sermons, number 272, where he writes about the Eucharist. And it sort of touches on that theme. And speak of Deacon Basco, when he walks in the door. We were just speaking about you. But remember that when Father Rainey did his presentation on the Eucharist, we talked a lot about, touching on that theme a lot, of it not being something that is tangible or discernible to our senses. Remember we talked about that? And so it kind of got me thinking that too is a natural kind of segue into talking about the communion of saints, because of what we profess that we believe, of course. And he says this is a tiny little excerpt from that homily, where he says, but your faith demands far subtler insight. And he's talking about the Eucharist, how you're not going to discern it with your senses, but your faith requires something more of you. Okay? And then, I remember Father Rainey touched on this, Tantum Ergo, the hymn by St. Thomas Aquinas, where he even says that it's our human senses fail. I think it's the final line of that first verse. Faith for all defects supplying when our human senses fail. Okay? Did you ever think about this? I mean, this is in our creed. That we believe in all things visible and invisible. And if you take that kind of to a level, this is where I hope to kind of make the nexus, the connection between the Eucharist today and talking about the communion of saints. If you think about what that means when we say visible and invisible, we're obviously talking about something that is beyond our senses. There's an invisible realm. We profess that. We say we believe that there is an invisible realm. And so I guess a really great question, and that's another Gustave Doré illustration, by the way, but that one's the original. It's still in the black and white, or the monochrome color. Are our senses the only way that we know truth? And how do we know that our senses can't be the only way we know truth? Have you ever thought about this? Do y'all want to get some more coffee and have a philosophical conversation this morning? Bobby Sue, you want to get some coffee and have a philosophical conversation?
I'll have some juice.
Okay.
But go ahead and start.
Okay, start without you, okay. But think about that. I mean, how do we know things that we know if our senses are the only input we have for knowledge, it's the only way that we know truth, then aren't we kind of in trouble? Do your senses ever deceive you? All the time. All the time. And I use this illustration with college philosophy students, freshman philosophy students. When we talk about those two different ways of knowing, that we know things, we get inputs through our senses, but then there's some metaphysical connection that we have that nobody can explain because it's not something we can quantify or observe, but we know that it exists. So for instance, I use this illustration about how, I mean, do you remember when you were a child, maybe your parents didn't do this to you, maybe mine were just cruel, but do you remember that, hearing that, okay, so if there is a thunderstorm, you can tell how close the lightning is if you see the lightning and then you count until you hear the thunder. Did you hear that? Okay. So I grew up believing, and I think many people do, just based on that kind of like informal knowledge, grew up believing that that means that lightning and thunder are two separate events. Do you know what I mean? Like you can tell how close the lightning is by listening for the thunder, and you somehow have this idea that one must be two separate events. When in fact, of course, they are happening simultaneously. But light travels faster than sound. And sometimes I'll have this, this wide-eyed kind of like realization in my students, like, you mean they're the same thing? Lightning doesn't cause the thunder? No, they're happening together. So that's a perfect example of what I mean when I say our senses can deceive us, and they do all the time. Have you ever been someplace and smelled a familiar odor? And maybe the odor wasn't there, but it evokes some sort of a memory, or you have some sort of a recall related to that. So yeah, I mean, so if our senses are the only way we know things, then we're missing, I think, a substantial part of our existence. And I wanted to make that connection this morning because where I want to go next is to talk about this visible and invisible, our visible and invisible realities. This is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that we have visible and invisible realities. And there we go. This is a doctrine. I mean, is this a visible or invisible reality? It's an invisible reality, unless you happen to be one of the great mystics of the Middle Ages who was gifted with visions, right? But it is an invisible reality to us. This is a teaching of the church that we find, of course, expressed in our Apostles' Creed. The earliest version we have of this actually comes from something called the apostolic tradition of Saint Hippolytus of Rome, who's writing in the 3rd century. This is how old this is. It is in the form of questions, or it's presented in the form of questions. It's an interrogatory that's used at baptisms in the early church. This is before there's an Apostles' Creed, but they're using this. This formulary appears. Do you believe in God the Father? Dunk. Right? 3 dunks, unless you're an infant. We did figure out pretty quickly to start sprinkling infants. But this was an interrogatory, 3 questions that the catechumen would answer at a baptism. And then, of course, it finds its way into fully expressed in our Apostles' Creed that we are all familiar with. This is, of course, the very first, this is the first thing we said, right? We began the rosary with the Apostles' Creed. By tradition, it was, and I will stress this, by tradition, it was composed by the apostles after Pentecost, which might explain why St. Hippolytus in Rome has this tradition in the 3rd century. But it is historically impossible for us to verify. Okay, I cannot stand here and cite you a source that says that we can verify that it was written by an apostle or drafted by the apostles. So fortunately for us, the value of it does not depend upon the solution of that historical problem. We don't have to know the historicity of it to know that we have incredible testimony to it from the early church. We know that it was in fact being used in the earliest church, Apostles' Creed. To distinguish it, of course, from our Nicene Creed, which does come later. Okay? So the Nicene Creed is using some of the same formulary the Council of Nicaea in 325. So we know that they drew a little bit from this kind of creedal tradition. But again, I can't give you a date on the Apostles' Creed. The Catechism of the Catholic Church calls this the oldest Roman catechism. If you want a catechism, you want to know what the church teaches, this is the first one, the oldest one. It carries its authority from the claim of, from the chair of Peter, the catechism would say. The creed is obviously Trinitarian, this one, our Nicene Creed we know is, but it begins with the first person of the Trinity, God the Father moving to the redemption of mankind through the second person of the Trinity, and then to the work of the third person, the Holy Spirit. So the Apostles' Creed is also a baptismal seal. It is a profession of faith, okay, to which we are entrusted on the day of our baptisms. So, why do I point all this out? What does the Apostles' Creed contain that our Nicene Creed does not? Remember, this is the earlier creed. Huh? Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, that's a right answer. That's not the one I was looking for, but that's a right answer. I should have said, what are some things that do not appear in our Nicene Creed?
Can you rephrase the question?
Anything in here that you do not find in our Nicene Creed, besides the descent into hell? I don't know, guys. I highlighted it on the slide. The Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins. Right. The communion of saints is the church. It is the church. The Catechism says that the term communion in this Apostles' Creed, when we say the communion of saints, the Catechism tells us that we are talking about two different kinds of communion. We are talking about communion of holy things and communion among holy persons. Two different things. So unpack that just a little bit. In the early church, remember that the communion in holy things would have been what we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, the shared goods, the shared community, right? When the apostles have devoted themselves to the prayers, the breaking of the bread, and the teaching, that there is this communal kind of relationship among shared things, okay? And then there is a communion in the shared faith that is a communion of holy people. So things and people, and hopefully we don't think of ourselves as things, we're people. But in our present reality, there are three states of the church according to the Catechism. Okay, so this is all out of the Catechism this morning. When the Lord comes in glory and all his angels with him, death will be no more, and all things will be subject to him. But right now, some of his disciples are pilgrims on earth. Can I get some hands? Anybody in here who's not? Right? We are the pilgrims on earth. Others have died, or they have passed from this earthly existence. I really don't like the word died, although that's even the word the Catechism used. They passed from this earth and are being purified. Okay, that's purgatory. And then others are already in glory, contemplating God in fullness. But all of us, no matter where we are in these three states of the church, all of us are in communion with each other in a mysterious, invisible way. In a mysterious, invisible way. It is here in this section of the Catechism that specifically speaks to the intercession of the saints, Being more closely united to Christ, those who dwell in heaven fix the whole church more firmly in holiness. By their fraternal concern, our weakness is greatly helped. So we have communion with holy people, and we have communion with the saints. The Catechism also says we have communion with the penitent. The penitent. So, the three states of the church. Three states of the church, existing inside of time and outside of time. In our physical reality and outside of our physical reality. So recently, I shared a teaching over with the folks at Jesus Good Shepherd in Monroe that I had done here in 2017. I don't know if you even remember that, but I did a series here in 2017 that was called Transcending History Through the Eyes of Faith. I didn't make that term up, okay? That's straight out of the Catechism, that's what the church does. The church transcends history. It exists in history, but it exists outside of time. It exists outside of our knowing, our physical ability to know, our physical ability to see and discern it. Actually, we tend to think that those of us who are here in the Pilgrim Church, I think that we think that our reality is easier to discern, right? It's in front of us. We can take it in with our senses. The higher reality is not that. Isn't that interesting? The higher reality of the church is that which is beyond our senses. The Catechism tells us that there's the Pilgrim Church. Sometimes you'll hear this called the church militant, which I kind of like that term. The church militant. To use kind of this imagery of us being in battle. Soldiers being in a fight against the sin of the world. Right? And also against the ruler of this world. Who is who? Satan. Yeah. So, there is the Pilgrim Church. And this comes straight out of Luke. Let me read this to you. This is when, remember, Jesus is facing the temptations from Satan, one of which was to offer to receive the kingdoms of the world without having to go to the cross. Mm-hmm. The easier, softer way. And Satan told Jesus, quote, I will give you all this domain in its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I will give it to whomever I wish. So this is why we sometimes think of the church as being militant, being in combat. And then the penitent church, sometimes called the church suffering, that is those souls who are in purgatory. The church triumphant, those who are already with God and who see God fully. So, the great mystery here is that we are all one church. And I have to tell you that I feel like this is something that the earliest Christians understood better than we do. That for them, especially if you read some of the fathers, I mentioned St. Augustine, but if you went back even a little bit earlier than that, to the apostolic fathers, I'm not going to ask you the test question because those of you that did the Voices of the Church series should be able to answer the question, who are the apostolic fathers of the church? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Okay. St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Clement of Rome. Is that ringing a bell? Do I need to come teach that again? Okay. St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Clement of Rome, and St. Polycarp of Smyrna. If you read the earliest, post-apostolic witnesses to the faith, that next generation, they are writing about this reality that way, that they are here with us. Think about when Christians were really forced to be underground during times of persecution, and they would go to the tombs of the saints to have Mass at the tombs of the saints, because that was a way of being physical communion with them, to express physically what they already understood to be a metaphysical reality. They knew they were in communion with them. I think in a way that somehow we've lost a little bit of that they are right here with us. So we do have this from, y'all know I like to quote some St. Jerome, don't you? If I ever get to bring you a guest speaker from the Church Triumphant, that's who I'm bringing you. just for the entertainment value alone. But St. Jerome is, this is that famous letter that I think I included in our last resource guide, where he's writing against, this priest, Vigilantius, he's writing against someone that he believes is a dangerous teacher. He's spreading some misinformation. And this is the man about whom St. Jerome said, I cannot mention his name without speaking profanity. Okay, that Deacon, I think, referenced before. So this from that same letter where he's answering Vigilantius, and Vigilantius is saying, you don't need to ask the saints to pray. You just go directly to God. Okay? And so St. Jerome answers him, and he says, well, if apostles and martyrs, while still in their body, can pray for others when they ought still to be anxious for themselves, why then, how much more must they do when they are crowned, when they've won their crowns, overcome, and triumphed? So what he's saying is he's making a reference to this communion of saints, that those of us who are in the Pilgrim Church are only separated from those in the Church Triumphant by the thinnest of veils. They are there to help us just like they were when they were here on earth. Okay? So how many of you, I've used this example before, and I know we've talked about it, but if you've ever had like a concern on your heart and you've called up a friend and said, could you pray for me? Right? Or just pass somebody, in the I don't know, pass them in the vestibule of the church and say, how are you doing? Well, not so good. Would you pray for me? Imagine think about the saints the same way. And not just those who have the capital ST in front of their name, but everybody in heaven. Everybody in heaven is a saint, right? I don't think that they're nearly, I don't know, maybe not nearly as entertaining as St. Jerome, but, well, anyway, he's keeping everyone entertained, no doubt. So, of course, we go directly to God. And as St. Jerome says, that there's just because you're asking someone to pray for you doesn't mean you don't also go directly to God with your own prayers. We do this as Christians all the time. And it's not worship to do so. It is not adoration. Again, to quote St. Jerome, he said, addressing Vigilantius, he says, quote, madman, aka Vigilantius, madman, who in the world ever adored the martyrs? Who ever thought man was God? So of course we pray directly to God, but because of what we believe about the church in those three states, pilgrims, penitents, and those who are already in glory, to do that. So what about people in heaven? Okay? We pray for those souls in purgatory. As a matter of fact, the entire month of November is dedicated to praying for souls in purgatory. I even put this in a flight note. Hopefully maybe you've added that to your devotions, to do that. I just sort of incorporated it into my daily prayers for the holy souls in purgatory. Okay. What about the people that are already in the church triumphant? Do they need our prayers? Have you ever thought about this? I don't think they need our prayers, right? They're already in the fullness of glory. They're already with God. But we sure benefit from theirs. We sure benefit from theirs and their direct help. But as Catholics, we understand this to mean that they help us to the extent that God's supreme will is served. Okay? There's no magic involved here. There's no doing you a favor, right? Well, don't tell the big guy I'm doing this. It is always, or in my case, her again. But it's always, we always ask for the intercession of the saints that God's will be done, that they are in a position to pray for us. So what we profess in the Apostles' Creed is the communion of saints, is a practical application of that. And it is an ancient practice, by the way. It is ancient. It is much like our practice of venerating saints. The remains of saints, which we've talked about in here before, probably derived around the same time. This idea that the physical remains of the holy people is imbued with so much fullness of God's grace that can be a conduit for us to the divine if we contemplate their holiness. It's not their physical remain that has any magical power, but it's the orientation of our hearts and our minds. So this was set forth at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. It says, the saints who reign together with Christ offer up their own prayers to God for men. It is good and it is useful to invoke them and to have recourse to their prayers and help for obtaining benefits from God through his Son, Jesus Christ. So anyone in heaven is a saint, right? Yes. Anyone in heaven is a saint. But then there are those canonized saints, like martyrs of every age. But intercessory prayer doesn't have to be to canonized saints. Got a family member that you feel pretty confident, or a friend that you feel confident is already in the church triumphant? You can ask for their intercession too. Evidence of miracles has been produced from just those kinds of prayers, even from people who are not canonized saints. And it's interesting that, it's sort of now being closer to the process than I ever thought I might be, of not becoming a saint myself, but closer to the process of beatification and canonization and having the opportunity to learn so much about that. It's really interesting how miracles factor so much in that process. It is, so think about it this way. Why would miracles be an expectation of someone who is going to be a canonized saint? Have you ever thought about this? Like, the church requires 2 miracles. There's one that's required for beatification, to be a blessed, and there's one that's required for canonization. Why would that be necessary?
I don't really know, but I would think because they're, let's put it like this, lack of a better word, closer to God, God would hear them because the miracle would only be performed by God.
Right. The miracle is performed by God, not by the saint, not by that person. But what does that tell us about that person? They're praying, they're interceding, right? So they're working. So if you are praying through the intercession of someone, and this is what we've tried to communicate about, for instance, our 5 servants of God, who, God willing, we will all live to see venerable. Some of you might live to see them blessed. I probably won't be here for that. But if you're praying through their intercession, you're praying with faith, with the expectation that they are interceding on your behalf. And we already have some miracles that are being investigated. So what that means, what that indicates, you see, to the church is that these people are indeed worthy of the recognition of the church. Does that make sense? That they're actively working on our behalf, which is a beautiful thing when you think about it. It's wrought by God, though. As Deacon said, I think we have to remember that. Any miracle is wrought by God. It's not by the saint. It can be through the saint, but not directly by that saint.
Is it true that you have to have some form of writing of this person?
No, no. The only time you have to have something written is if, that person is being considered for a doctor of the church. How many of you paid attention, thank you for bringing that up, that's a great segue. How many of you paid attention, last week when the USCCB was meeting in Baltimore, their plenary session, that they passed a unanimous resolution to recommend that, Cardinal Saint, John Henry Newman, be considered as a doctor of the church? Yeah, that's when you have to have writings. Because that title is given to people who make significant intellectual contributions to the faith. You know, we have plenty of saints who didn't leave writings.
There was the priest that I know that passed away almost 2 years ago. And I know the person that is trying to start the process of him becoming a saint.
Uh-huh.
And he literally saw that this priest's brother throwing some of his notes out, and he was like, no, don't.
Yeah.
be
No,
doing
well, if
this
you
way."
know that a person is going to potentially be, having just done this, I can tell you, if you know that somebody is going to be in the process of canonization, then you have an obligation to save and archive and preserve anything that they wrote, anything at all. But I can tell you, in the case of our 5 priests, we have 3 of them who wrote a lot. One of them was the president of the seminary in Natchitoches, and he wrote more than I wished he had. Okay, because I'm having to get all that translated out of the French. Certainly theological writings. But then we have one we have absolutely nothing for. Absolutely nothing that he wrote at all. That's not required. Okay? What's required is evidence of the sanctity of their lives, heroic virtue. That's what the church looks for, is heroic virtue. And when you think about it, I want to say one thing, and as I told you, I need to shut us down early this morning. But as somebody who regularly prays through the intercession of a few of my heavenly friends, and I do, how many of you do? If you don't, it's a good practice. I mean, it really is. And I think over time you begin to sort of feel like you know that person. You know? As somebody who regularly does that, it helps me to have a more eternal perspective. I've talked about this before. I think one of the benefits of having a devotion of daily Mass is the same, that just gradually over time you begin to have, looking at the people that I know go to daily Mass, just gradually over time, don't you, you begin to have that more eternal perspective. Just gradual. It's not anything dramatic, but there's an awareness of it more than there was before. And I think the same is true when you make this a part of your devotion. Asking for the intercession of the saints gives us a more eternal perspective. And I have found also, if you think about it, you might expect a historian to say this, so please don't take it that way. Please forget what I do. But do you know that when you can connect sort of like across time with someone who came before us, maybe physically or in a linear sense came before us, when you can connect with that person or that community or that era, you're actually expanding your own experience of just being alive. Your existence becomes bigger. Does that make sense? Because I know him. Well, he lived 150 years ago. I know, but I know him. Right? So it really kind of expands your own life, your own meaning. So as I said, this is no different for me than asking any living friend, someone here with me in the Pilgrim Church, to pray for me. Absolutely no difference at all. Because we believe in the communion of saints. We believe in the communion of saints. And the church in its 3 states, always fully eternal and always fully united. We are the ones who don't get the full picture. Right? We don't get the full picture. Does all that make sense this morning? So I thought this would be like an interesting little segue from what Deacon talked about when he did the holiness and saints. So I have just about a minute and I need to cut out of here, but yes.
I have a question about the five priests.
Yes.
So, I've always kind of wondered this. We talk about them as a group and
Right.
like being canonized as
Yes,
a group.
they will be.
But how does that work for a miracle? How do,
We just
there's
need one.
5 of them.
Yes, but we just need one. Any 5 of them can do it.
But how do they get, in the church, how do they get grouped like that?
That is a decision that's made in Rome by the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints. And originally, when Father Peter and I met with the Dicastery in Rome in 2000, was when he was diocesan administrator. So that was like 2019. When we first started this process, they told us they had to go forward as 5 separate causes. Okay? Which would mean that one of them might make it and 3 of them might not, or, you know, but that they had to go forward as 5 causes. And so then we had a couple of cardinals that got involved in the cause. One of them in particular is, today it was, he's a cardinal now, one of the greatest champions we have for this. Sort of encouraged us to petition the dicastery to have them combined as one cause, because they died in the same cause together. It was the same, the same event. And they died within literally 20 days of each other. So much like St. Isaac Jogues and the martyrs, and the North Korean martyrs, that are all lumped together. So we petitioned for that in 2020, and the dicastery granted the request. And I think everybody was a little surprised, because it's a rare thing. But what that means is that because they're going forward as one cause, any of them can do a miracle, and they all get credit for it. Just like group work when you were in high school, there was one person that did all the work, right? And then everybody else gets the same good grade. But for us, it's good, because that means that we need one miracle for beatification. And as I said, there's a couple that are already being investigated for that. And they involve 2 different priests. And then we will need one for canonization. So, I don't know. I don't know who it's going to be, but it's going to, the other 3 or 4 are going to be hanging back going, okay, yeah, you take care of that. But it's been a beautiful thing to be involved in. I have to scoot, but thank you guys so much, and I will see you week after next, okay? Come back, week after next.